looking at now animal responses. Again, animal responses are there to increase the chances of the animal's survival. All right, and I will ask you to go back to the stimulus response pathway. Well, at least we did it like that. When we looked at the nervous system, we looked at the nervous system as part of or enabling the stimulus response pathway, which means there's sensory neurons, there's relay neurons, and there's motor neurons, and connect them all up to appropriate sensors and effectors, and to any given to a given stimulus, you make an appropriate response. Okay, so we go back to that, and so the stimulus response pathway as a kind of a theme that ties all of this together, and that's really important for me. Trying to make sense of things is not about remembering everything. Ultimately it is that, but your chances of remembering everything is greatly increased when you have certain big ideas that connect things up and allows you to put things in their place. All right, so stimulus response pathway, we begin then with the nervous system. So the nervous system, and the nervous system is divided right into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. How have I organized it here? Central nervous system with the spinal cord, which we're not really going to talk that much about, so I'm going to put it here. Spinal cord. But the brain is something that we are going to have to spend some time on. So the brain goes up there. Okay. Let's just kind of fully flesh out then this peripheral nervous system, and then we'll get back to the brain. So the peripheral nervous system, it's divided into the sensory neurons, which we're not going to talk too much about, and the motor neurons. Right? Remember, the relay neurons are in the central nervous system. Okay? So we have the sensory and the motor is basically, the motor neurons is what stimulates all the effectors. So that's going to allow us to talk about a lot of responses. So the motor neurons then, we can have different types. The motor neuron, how have I done this now? So the motor neurons can be somatic, which we're not going to talk so much about. So effectors, essentially muscles which are under our conscious control. And I guess the more interesting stuff that's happening, which is not under our conscious control, which is autonomic. So we have the autonomic. Now, in the autonomic, we have two kinds of things that happen, on a spectrum of kind of immediate urgency. We have fight and flight, and we have rest and digest, right? So the fight and flight responses are carried out by the sympathetic motor neurons, and the rest and digest functions are stimulated, or the rest and digest responses are stimulated by the parasympathetic. These sympathetic and parasympathetic motor neurons, they both end at an effector organ. It could be the heart, it could be the adrenal glands. So the way that they stimulate opposite responses, or opposite responses from those effector organs, is by releasing different neurotransmitters. Okay, right? So opposite effects. So they have opposite effects. And the way they do that is by releasing different neurotransmitters. So sympathetic motor neurons release the neurotransmitter noradrenaline. Parasympathetic motor neurons release acetylcholine. and in that way they induce different responses from their effector organ. Okay, so for example, from the medulla oblongata, the cardiovascular control center, you have sympathetic and motor neurons going to the heart, the sinoatrial node, right? So these neurotransmitters both affect the sinoatrial node of the heart, but noradrenaline, so they bind to a receptor. So this is a square and it will bind to a different receptor. Now, on the membrane of a cell of the sinoatrial node, you have this enzyme, adenylate cyclase. That doesn't really help with my notation there. I'll just put ASC there. Adenylate cyclase is an enzyme, and this enzyme makes cyclic AMP. Okay, now the more cyclic AMP you have, the more the heart rate increases. Cyclic AMP is the second messenger. So when noradrenaline binds to the receptor on the cell of the sinoatrial node, adenylate cyclase is activated. But when acetylcholine binds to the sinoatrial node, adenylate cyclase is inhibited. All right, so we just need to appreciate this idea, and I think that's an important idea because it fundamentally then allows us to understand how the different responses of certain organs during certain different and opposing situations can occur. All right, let's move on. Let's keep moving quickly. Let's go back to the brain then. Now, as part of the brain, we need to know the different parts of the brain, and very briefly, we need to know where they are, and we need to know what their functions are. Again, briefly, not in detail. All right? So what are the parts of the brain then? We have cerebrum, cerebellum, we have the medulla oblongata, we have the hypothalamus, and we have the pituitary gland. Okay, so again, the point of this video is not to kind of elaborate on all of these things, but just to remind you that they are there and don't miss it in your revision because it is important. Okay, so we have these things. Again, if given a diagram, know where these things are and 1 or 2 sentences on what their responsibility is, what that part of the brain is responsible for. Okay? All right, let's move on. So now that we've done the brain, we will then look at reflexes. Okay, no, we won't look at reflexes yet. We will now go to the, what shall we do? What shall we do? We will now look at one of the experiences of the brain. Again, what I like to do is like just try and give it a story. So that's the nervous system, okay? And one of the things that the nervous system allows us to do is to take our experience, understand what is our situation, and then make an appropriate response. Okay? So one of those experiences that we could have is stress. Okay? The irony is not lost on a teacher of students during exam time teaching about stress. Okay? But yeah, but I guess, you know, understanding it, you know, if you understand something, it maybe becomes slightly easier to deal with, right? But all right, so stress is experienced in the brain due to sensory inputs, right? And the response that we make to this situation is the fight and or flight, fight or flight response. Okay, all right, so what is that? Now this is where I will kind of detail a little bit, but there's a lot between the lines that I'm missing out, but I'm going to put the main checkpoints of the response. Okay, so in this fight and flight response, we have the main player, which is the hypothalamus. Remember that the brain is an interconnect, even though we like to say this is that structure and that's that structure there, ultimately the brain is just a giant squashed together interconnected neurons. And when certain sensory inputs come in, we see something that stresses us out, we hear something that stresses us out, anything like that, it all kind of passes through the different parts of the brain, and ultimately will get to, or those impulses will find their way to the hypothalamus, because that's going to allow the person to respond appropriately. Okay, so the hypothalamus then is where those impulses, stress caused impulses, will arrive, and from that there are going to be two kinds of responses, one involving the endocrine system and hormones, and the other one involving neurons, nervous system, and ultimately the release of other hormones. Okay, so the hypothalamus is then going to stimulate the pituitary, right, through the, through the release of a hormone. The pituitary then releases another hormone that stimulates the adrenal cortex, or the adrenal glands. The adrenal cortex releases cortisol. Sometimes I'm looking at this piece of paper because I don't remember everything. Sometimes I'm looking at this piece of paper because I just need to know where to put the stuff. So if you're having trouble remembering this stuff, remember the adrenal, because there's the adrenal cortex and then there's the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex is what releases cortisol. All right, what's the point of releasing cortisol? How does that help in a stress response? Well, remember, most of the time, the reason this response developed was not to help people deal with exams. It was to survive attacks by predator or things like that. So what we're thinking of is we're preparing the body for some kind of exertion, some kind of exercise, extreme form of that. So cortisol, what it does is ultimately it causes an increase in blood glucose, right? So the blood glucose goes up, and that means there's more glucose available for the muscles to carry out respiration, to produce ATP, so that they can keep contracting their muscles, which we will eventually get to. Okay, so how does cortisol do that? Well, cortisol is got two main targets. One is skeletal muscle, and in the skeletal muscles, it's promoting the conversion of protein to amino acids. All right, and then the liver can use those amino acids, convert them to glucose. The other target is the liver, and in the liver, it's promoting glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis, hope you can read that, but you can hear it. Glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, and the glucose is released into the blood. So the blood glucose levels go up, and I hope that makes sense. Remember, the body's preparing itself for activity. All right, what's the other part of this response? The other part is that the hypothalamus, where have I put this now? The hypothalamus, via the sympathetic, so that was the hormonal response, but the hypothalamus, being part of the brain, is also hooked up neuronally to different parts of the body via motor neurons. So it uses the sympathetic motor neurons that it has, which go all the way to the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla in response releases adrenaline. Okay, and in that, adrenaline goes in the blood, and it will, among many other effects, it will increase the heart rate. Okay, again, with the higher heart rate, where it improves the oxygen supply to the muscles, improves the carbon dioxide removal from the muscles, and allows both, and therefore we got more oxygen and more glucose going to the muscles in readiness for increased activity. Okay, is there something I'm forgetting? I think that's it, but I think we also have the sympathetic neurons also affecting the sinoatrial node, but that might be through the adrenal medulla. So we will leave that out for now. Okay, adrenaline, yeah. So actually, yeah, the adrenaline will affect the sinoatrial node and cause the heart rate to go up in a very similar way to what we discussed right here. Okay, good. I think we are nearly there. What remains is examples of the stimulus response pathway in the form of reflexes. Okay, so in terms of the reflexes, what has come up, and I've seen it a number of times, is the point of reflexes, or what's the advantages of having reflexes? What's the advantage of having information that doesn't go to the brain every single time? Okay, so advantages of reflex has come up before. Have a few advantages in your bank. Okay, and then we look at examples. Okay, so in terms of the examples, we have the blink response. Again, I'm not going to go through it too much. Those are just kind of things you will have to look at and understand. Understand it. Once you've got it, remember it. So we've got the blink response, and we've got the knee jerk response. Okay, so those are our two examples. Having said that, they are kind of a bit standalone type things, but again, I like to have a narrative to everything. Both of these, that's great. Both of these end in an effector that is a muscle. So that takes us to muscles, because both of these use a muscle as the end effector. Okay, so we're going to use this opportunity to go to muscles at this point. So what do you need to know in relation to muscles? Because usually what happens is there's a stimulus, sensory neurons, relay neurons, motor neuron is stimulated, and the motor neuron ends in a muscle which allows, usually it's the muscle that allows the response. So we're going to spend some time on muscles now. So we need to understand that, you know, what's the organization of the muscle tissue. So we got muscle tissue being bundles of muscle cells. All right, so each muscle cell is called a muscle fiber, and each muscle fiber being a multinucleate cell, at least in the case of skeletal muscles, being a multinucleate cell with, in its cytoplasm, this contractile structure called the myofibril. So we've got, in the cytoplasm, we've got lots of these myofibril structures, and there's lots of muscle fibers which make up the muscle tissue. Okay, so in the cytoplasm or the sarcoplasm, we've got the myofibril. It's a contractile cytoskeletal structure. Okay, and the myofibril itself is made up of these repeating units called sarcomeres. Now, in relation to the sarcomere, what I'd kind of recommend is that in a particular part of your brain, you know what the structure of the sarcomere is, or at least if it's presented to you, you could identify bits of it, okay? The actin bits, the myosin bits. I don't always remember the Z line and the I band and all that stuff, but if it is labeled, I think it's always like a good baseline to be able to say what's, you know, visually what's going to get smaller and what's going to get larger, or what's going to stay the same size when the sarcomere contracts. Okay, so understand that. Right, so once we know the structure, then I guess the next thing is the mechanism of muscle contraction, the sliding filament hypothesis, or the sliding filament model. Right, so we've got the sliding filament hypothesis right there. And if you can't see everything that I'm writing, apologies for that. But hopefully you've been listening along and you're maybe drawing a version of this for yourself as well. So we got the sliding filament hypothesis. Again, this is not the place to discuss the ins and outs of that, but know it. Okay, it's not very complicated. It is, I mean, actually it's difficult to understand, but once you've spent enough time, you will get it. And once you've got it, it's not an 8-mark essay to write about what happens. Okay, or actually it might be 8 marks, but it's definitely not 16 marks. Okay. Anyway, once we know what the basics of the sliding filament hypothesis is and how that results in sarcomere shortening, and ultimately, if we know how one sarcomere shortens, we know how the whole muscle tissue contracts. Well, once we've got that, we need to understand the role of ATP in that process, because respiration, which is also on the content list, ties in very closely with that, because respiration provides the ATP that is needed for muscle contraction. Okay, and if there's anything in the body that's using up a lot of ATP, it is the muscle. All right, finally, I think lesser known, or something that we might pay less attention to, is the role of calcium ions in that process. And it is very important because the calcium is really the way that we are controlling. It's not the ATP is constantly being supplied, but it's the calcium, the presence of the calcium is what is allowing us to control the muscles when they contract and when they don't, and for us to be able to coordinate them in such a way that we can speak, we can walk, we can dance, okay, all those things. So it's all the control is via the calcium, but the mechanism, the energy provision for the contraction is via the ATP. But anyway, what that means is we need to understand how the events at a neuromuscular junction. So how a motor neuron, so the motor neuron is essentially synapsed to the muscle fiber, how is it that an action potential in the motor neuron causes the contraction of the muscle? So understand how that happens. Again, it's once you know it, it is not very lengthy to describe. It's not super detailed. Okay, so understand the events of the neuromuscular junction, and finally understand that yes, the main muscle that we will deal with is the skeletal muscle, but there are different types. There's different types of muscle, okay? There's cardiac, there is smooth, and there is the one that we've been spending a lot of time on, and that's the skeletal. Understand what they look like, understand what their different functions are. And I think that is it. So, guys, I hope that is, not too frightening. I was able to do that in relatively short space of time. As you revisit this stuff kind of repeatedly, again, you don't have to go into every single detail every single time. All right, so the more you repeat the content, maybe take your foot off the gas in terms of detail, but try and get the breadth of all the content down. Okay, So the first time you look at stuff, you've got to look at all the details so that you get it. But the more and more you look at stuff, you might want to just kind of take like a step back and try and understand the whole scope of what we're looking at, so that, because remember, when you walk into an exam, you don't know what out of all this is going to be demanded of you or asked of you, or, you know, I don't know how polite examiners are, but they might even request information from you in the form of a question. You don't know which of this is coming up. Okay, so it really makes me very uncomfortable when people know some bits and don't know other bits. Like, on what basis are we making that judgment? Because examiners could ask us anything. All right, guys, I hope this has been helpful. Even if I don't get around to doing all the other topics, please, I hope in some way you are inspired and you can see that it's actually not that difficult, and try and do this for yourself. Good luck.